Latitude Media, podcast at the frontier of climate technology.
I'm Shail Khan, and this is Catalyst.
The world is going to need a lot more food by 2050 to feed, nearly 10 billion people. And it's going to have to do it without more land and with a lot fewer emissions.
Coming up, we've got indoor ag, we've got industrial agriculture, we've got cellular agriculture, all the fun stuff. It's a conversation with Mike Grunwald.
The electric grid is changing. Utilities need smarter solutions to balance supply and demand, especially as they face growing renewables and electrification. With Energy Hub, utilities can manage all of their customers' connected devices, like batteries, EVs, and smart thermostats, in one platform to grow their virtual power plants and seamlessly shape electricity demand. Unlock the power of flexibility at scale and deliver more value through cross-DER dispatch with Energy Hub, the leading edge DERMS provider. Visit energyhub.com to learn more.
Catalyst is brought to you by Antenna Group, the communications and marketing partner for mission-driven organizations developing and adopting climate solutions. Their team of experts help businesses like yours identify, refine, and amplify your authentic climate story. With over 3 decades of experience as a growth partner to the most consequential brands in the industry, their team is ready to make an impact on day one. Get started today at antennagroup.com.
I'm Shail Khan. I invest in revolutionary climate technologies at Energy Impact Partners. Welcome. All right, so one thing we, I think, haven't talked a lot about here are some of the areas where traditional environmentalist views sometimes conflict with the ideal thing to do if what you're optimizing for is combating climate change. Nuclear power is probably a good example of this, or sometimes things like wildlife protection in areas that are attractive to build renewable power, or transmission line build out. Transmission line build out. Anyway, another one of those that I think is sort of under-discussed is in the agriculture world, where I think the traditional sort of progressive environmental perspective is one that favors smaller farms that are local, using less chemicals, less genetic engineering, et cetera. But as our guest this week, Mike Grunwald, points out in a really good recent op-ed in the New York Times, industrial agriculture is basically the only thing holding us back from even worse climate calamity. And we may need to do a whole lot more of it in the future in order to feed the growing global population. It also intersects with all these other areas of technology that have been emerging in the food and agriculture world, like indoor agriculture, like regenerative agriculture, like cultivated meat. All these kinds of things play into this question of how are we simultaneously solving the problem of feeding the global population while not increasing emissions and not increasing land use. Anyway, Mike is a journalist who's been covering this stuff for an extremely long time, talking about it for a long time. He has a book coming out on the topic this summer. And so ahead of that book's publication, I brought Mike on to just kind of talk through a grab bag of topics in the world of agriculture as it relates to climate change. Here's Mike. Mike, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me, Shail.
I'm excited to catch back up after a long time since the last time we chatted. And there's a lot, I think, for us to cover here because you've been thinking and writing about issues related to agriculture and food and climate for a long time. And it's a multifaceted, complex problem. I'll maybe have you start at the highest level, which is as you think about the intersection of food and land and climate, what are the multiple variables we are trying to solve for here? Like, what are the puzzle pieces we need to put together?
No, that's a great question because I really have been, in my cave for a few years thinking about this. And, the basic problem is that the world is going to need a lot more food by 2050 to feed, nearly 10 billion people. And it's going to have to do it without more land and with a lot fewer emissions. And the numbers are really gigantic. We're probably at this point going to need about 6 quadrillion more calories by 2050, which is, I like to say it's like a dozen Olive Garden breadsticks every day for every human being on Earth. That's extra we're going to have to grow. And at the same time, we're going to have to do it with no more land where we're currently on track even if we continue to increase farm yields at the same rate they've increased throughout the Green Revolution, we're going to need another 2 Indias worth of land, which essentially means, kind of bye-bye Amazon and Congo rainforests, very much not good. And at the same time, we're going to have to reduce emissions from food and land, which is about a third of our emissions overall. We're going to have to reduce it 75, 80%. So the challenge is just enormous, and it leads to some real trade-offs, sometimes unpleasant ones.
So it seems like, if I'm hearing you right, to boil down what you think are the sort of core things we need to simultaneously be thinking about, it is total number of calories, like the amount of food we produce globally. It is the amount of land that it takes to produce that amount of food, and that it is the emissions associated with the production of that.
Yeah,
food.
you've nailed it. And there are, right now, we're on track for, to come way short. And, when I talk about, how are we going to feed the world without frying the world, there are always, people have these Malthusian discussions where it's like, oh, we're heading for a catastrophe. The entire world is going to go hungry. And it is terrible that you have almost 1 billion people right now who are, food insecure and not getting enough to eat. But the fact is that the world is pretty good about meeting food demand. If we need more food, and people can get paid for it, they'll make more. The problem is the without frying the world side. And can you do it without chopping down what's left of the, forests and wetlands that, really we need to store all that, store all the carbon for all the, the fossil fuels we've been pumping into the air. So it really is a tough problem.
Okay, so that gets to, you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times recently that I liked a lot, that I would frame as sort of a defense of industrial agriculture. Maybe walk me through
semi-defense.
Semi-defense. Right? It felt pretty full-throated to me. But yeah, walk me through why you thought you needed to defend industrial agriculture, and in this context of solving for those 3 things simultaneously, why is industrial agriculture, and maybe more and more industrialized agriculture, actually the way to do it?
Sure. Well, I think to take the first part of your question of why I needed to defend industrial agriculture, it's because everybody hates it, right? Industrial agriculture itself is kind of this phrase that essentially means bad, right? Like factory farms. Nobody's saying something good about that. And there is a lot not to like about it, right? I mean, they treat animals badly. In these packing houses, they treat people badly. They use too many antibiotics. They create too much water and air pollution. And, they do create a lot of greenhouse gas emissions as well. There's, their politics are bad. Their culture is often bad. I get why there's a lot of, people upset about this whole notion that we're packing lots of animals into small areas, that we're growing monocultures and bombing them with chemicals. I get it. The reason for the defense is to go back to what we were talking about what agriculture needs. What is agriculture's main job over the next, 25 years? It's going to be to make tons of food without much land. And that's what industrial ag is good about. Factories are good at manufacturing stuff. And we're going to need to manufacture a lot of food without expanding our agricultural footprint. And it turns out that, if you try to stop using agrochemicals that people don't like because they make a mess. Well, we saw what happened in Sri Lanka, where they banned them and immediately farm yields crashed. Sri Lanka could no longer feed itself and essentially started outsourcing not only its food production, but the pollution and emissions from that production. So I just think, there are a lot of there are many, many reasons to not like industrial agriculture, but there's one really good reason to like it, and it's that it makes food extremely efficiently, and we need efficiency.
Okay, so you mentioned a minute ago what would happen if we continued to increase our yield per unit land in the future. How much have we increased it historically? Like, what has been the trajectory of our land use efficiency for industrial agriculture?
Well, since the 1960s, with the beginning of the Green Revolution, which people think of as, the sort of higher yield wheat that Norman Borlaug started to grow. But I think it also includes, synthetic fertilizers and, really awesome tractors and, this irrigation projects, this entire, universe of yield and increasing technologies. Basically, we've tripled yields since the 1960s. So we're producing 3 times as much food, or as much calories, as much protein per acre. Our livestock efficiency has also increased by a factor of 3. And all of those sort of scary numbers I gave at the beginning about, how we are going to need 1.5 billion acres of extra land by 2050 on the current trajectory, that assumes we continue to increase yields at the same rate. So if we don't increase yields at all until 2050, we're going to need 7 more Indias worth of land. So we're going to need a lot more food.
Has their trajectory been pretty consistent? Like, if I looked at that chart of yields since the 1960s, has it been steady, or are we hitting an asymptote? Does it look weird, like we're hitting an asymptote? Is there an obvious, I guess what I'm asking is there an obvious next set of things that are coming down the pike that you could say, okay, this is how we're going to continue to increase yield?
Well, let me take the first question first, because the answer is not so great. Because if we go back to the 1960s, we're going to need 2 more Indias. But yield growth has actually tapered off a little bit in the last couple decades. And if they only continue to increase at that rate, we're going to need 3 more Indias. So yeah, that's we're going to actually need more yield growth than we've already had. I think there is a lot of excitement about some promising new technologies, some of which farmers are just starting to adopt, some of which may take some time to adopt, but we're going to need it. And essentially, what I always like to say, and others say it too, is that we're going to need, not just more green revolution, but a truly greener revolution, where, not just more synthetic fertilizers, but fertilizers that can, get more nitrogen into plants without getting the nitrogen into the Gulf of Mexico and creating a dead zone the size of Connecticut, and without creating nitrous oxide emissions that are 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide.
Well, that's a good example of where these things, there can be a little bit of a push and pull here, right? So one way to increase yields, at least to a first order, is going to be adding more synthetic fertilizer, or adding fertilizer where we're not using it otherwise. But of course, that results in more nitrous oxide emissions, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, behind CO2 and methane. So yeah, I guess the question is, how do we thread that needle of get the yields up, but don't just play a game of whack-a-mole and create emissions that overcome that somewhere else?
Right. And, as long as I really try not to be like Debbie Downer about this stuff, because I am excited about a lot of these solutions, but to add a little bit more Debbie Downerism, one of the reasons this is going to be so hard is because the Green Revolution has already spread to so much of the world that a lot of the low-hanging yield and emissions fruit has already been plucked. A great example there is large-scale irrigation projects. Only 5 to 7% of the world's agriculture that could be irrigated still needs to be irrigated, which is a sort of wonky way of saying that it's going to be a lot harder to increase yields, now that most farmland is irrigated and fertilized than it was when most farmland wasn't. And at the same time, of course, you have climate change, which is another threat, sort of an ironic threat to yields. You're talking, some scientists think that it could decrease wheat yields by as much as 1/3 over the next few decades, whereas you start to see particularly the heat waves and droughts, but also the worse floods, the worse storms, the spread of pests and diseases to new areas that used to be too cold for them to flourish. There's a lot of bad stuff coming down the pike, which again only emphasizes the need for us to decrease our demand for the most land-intensive products, such as beef and lamb. We're going to have to waste less food. We're going to have to use less land for biofuels. But then on the supply side, we're going to have to do a lot better at making a lot more food with a lot less land. And as you said, we can't just say, hey, more fertilizer, because actually we already waste half of the fertilizer that we're putting down on these fields. If anything, we're going to have to use less fertilizer.
Catalyst is brought to you by Energy Hub. Energy Hub helps utilities build next-generation virtual power plants that unlock reliable flexibility at every level of the grid. The Energy Hub platform takes the guesswork out of balancing energy supply and demand. It uses AI-driven optimizations to precisely shape load profiles and dispatch multiple types of customer devices for maximum grid impact. As the industry leader, Energy Hub helps more than 70 utilities manage 1.5 million devices, more than any other edge terms on the market. Click the link in the show notes to learn more, or go to energyhub.com.
Catalyst is brought to you by Antenna Group, the OGs of PR and marketing for climate tech. Is your brand a leader or challenger? Are you looking to win the hearts and minds of customers, partners, or investors? If you're a startup, investor, enterprise, or innovation ecosystem that's helping drive climate's age of adoption, Antenna Group is ready to power your impact. Visit antennagroup.com to learn more.
Getting into maybe slightly controversial territory, in climate tech world, there are a lot of folks focused on, various forms of like regenerative agriculture, and I think what you called carbon farming, but, increasing soil carbon sequestration and stuff like that. I guess the sense that I get from what you're saying and what you wrote in the op-ed is like, you think that's sort of the wrong way to tackle the problem. And the right way to tackle the problem is basically increase yields, like decrease land use or minimize land use. And if you do that, you have a bigger carbon impact, at least at a macro level, than whatever you're going to do that's more regenerative and might actually at the local level reduce emissions or increase carbon uptake in the soil or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to, as you said, I've written a book and I get into some of this in a lot more detail, so I'll just have to oversimplify here. But regenerative agriculture definitely does some nice stuff for the soil, and it can, in moderate ways, help the biodiversity on the farm. But first of all, to the extent that regenerative or organic or basically more natural, kinder and gentler forms of agriculture make less food per acre, they're going to need more acres to make food. Agriculture that is less intensive needs to be more extensive. And that's a disaster for biodiversity, right? That's coming straight out of the peatlands and the forests that are storing biodiversity and storing carbon. So yeah, to the extent that regenerative agriculture reduces yields, and what I would say is that it usually does. There are some regenerative practices that are consistent with excellent yields, and I'm all for that. But this idea that we need to sort of shut down these horrible industrial monocultures and shift to these lovely, more natural fields of diverse crop rotations and no chemicals. There's a reason that human beings, converted a lot of natural areas into agriculture. And it was because it made more food. And the idea that making agriculture more like nature, there's going to be a yield hit to that.
You mentioned needing to eat less beef and lamb. I guess I want to talk a little bit more about that and how different forms of food production use land. I mean, we think of, as an example, I think folks who listen to this podcast, we've talked about it before, know part of the problem of beef being ruminant emissions from essentially burps for the most part. But I think people talk a little bit less about the land impact. So can you just orient me in terms of what is a good land efficient source of calories and what is not?
Sure. I mean, the best ones are it's kind of what you'd expect. It's beans, it's lentils, it's other pulses. And then, what's also pretty good is soy and corn or maize, right? These incredibly efficiently grown crops. And now, if you're feeding it to if you're running that soybean through a chicken, it's not quite as efficient as eating it in the form of tofu or edamame. But in general, the plants are very efficient. Chicken and pork is less efficient, but beef and other ruminants are spectacularly inefficient. It takes about 9 calories worth of grain to produce 1 calorie worth of chicken meat. And when it comes to cows, which are, much less efficient, dairy is even worse, and beef, it's extraordinary. It can be 30, 50, some people would say 100 times as inefficient as just, eating grain directly. So interestingly, I've cut out beef basically because I didn't want to be such a journalistic hypocrite. I still eat meat because I'm bad and meat is delicious. But going vegan is fantastic, and that's the best thing you can do for your diet for the climate. But going vegetarian is usually about the same as just cutting out beef, because vegetarians tend to eat more dairy. So beef is such the baddie, as Tamar and I used to talk about in Climavores, that it really overwhelms the math.
Does that mean that your view, there's all these solutions out there like feed additives for cattle and things like that to reduce their methane emissions, the cow burps and so on. Is your view on that it is a step in the right direction but insufficient? Because at best, even if it were 100% efficacious, if it worked and totally removed those emissions, you'd still have the problem you're describing of how much land we use to grow the crops to feed the cows. So do you think about that stuff as a Band-Aid that's a distraction, or do you think about it as like a step in the right direction, but it alone is not going to do the trick?
Definitely not a distraction. I'm very excited about some of these feed additives, but I think you're absolutely right. They're not as important as, basically making beef more efficiently. I've gone to Brazil, where a shocking amount of the cattle ranches have almost no cows on them. They're considered degraded. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of acres, several Iowas worth of land that's basically being wasted on just a few cows. And it turns out it's not that hard to triple the efficiency, or sometimes even quadruple the efficiency of those cattle ranches. And that moves the needle a lot more than, giving feedlot cattle, and remember, they're only in the feedlot for a very small portion of their life. I'm all for feeding them the various additives that can, some people think reduce their emissions while they're on those additives as much as 80%. That's terrific. But like you said, those emissions are a very small part of the, of what makes cattle such a climate disaster.
What about when we think about the, sort of the next generation of technologies? If you're thinking about it from a climate perspective, I suppose cellular ag, in terms of calories per acre, I imagine would be extraordinarily good, right?
Phenomenal. Yeah, it's great.
So the issues with it are not climate issues, but rather cost and regulatory and so on.
Exactly. It's great for the climate, and I think the problems are cost, taste, and regulatory. Now, I've had some, what is often derogatorily, or is that even a word? What people, when they're being derogatory, call lab-grown meat. I think the preferred term of art these days is cultivated meat. I've had cultivated burger. I've had cultivated fried chicken. I've had cultivated salmon nigiri. And I'll tell you, I think it's great. And it sends that kind of meat signal of 2 million years of evolution saying hi in a way that even I've found, I like Impossible Burgers a lot, but to me, they taste like a really good substitute. The cell-based meats taste like meat because they're meat, from an animal, just grown. If you can grow beef without growing the cow and without growing the hooves and without growing the reproductive systems and the breathing and, the pooping and all the stuff that, takes a lot of energy. You can imagine how it could be a really efficient process. Now, right now, they're basically using sort of pharma grade equipment to make food. And, it's the economics of growing somebody a new heart are a lot easier than the economics of growing lunch. But, the long-winded way of saying for the climate, it's fantastic. And I really hope they get it to market.
From an economic standpoint, are you optimistic? Do you think that, do you see a pathway toward cellular ag that approaches the cost of animals?
I do. They've reduced the costs, I guess I would say certainly at least 99.9% in the last decade, probably closer to 99.99%. The last mile really matters. They're not competitive yet, and they certainly won't until they start building factories and making this stuff at scale. And of course, it's hard to make this stuff at scale when they're not inexpensive enough, which is why I do think government assistance is going to be, a big part of the solution here. So far, the entire cultivated meat industry has had about $3 billion worth of investment in its entire history. And the Inflation Reduction Act is, building battery factories in Georgia that are going to be twice that. And the entire solar industry in the first half of last year, I think, had about $250 billion worth of investment. So, it's made incredible progress in a very short amount of time. That said, I don't know. Some people think they'll never make it. I tend to think, look, I walk around every day with a device in my pocket that gives me access to all the world's knowledge. And, I can order something that comes to my house the next day, and I can use it as a flashlight and video chat with somebody on the other side of the world. So I have a lot of faith in these people who, these very smart people who are working on technological solutions to very hard problems. But I'd be lying if I said, oh no, they're definitely going to make it. I know it. They might.
All right, moving on to another category of other technologies that have a role to play here or may. What about indoor agriculture? So there's various versions of it, right? There's greenhouse, and then there's fully closed environment agriculture, vertical farming, that kind of thing. The latter, of course, having seen a pretty brutal past couple of years, a bunch of company bankruptcies and so on. As you think about it from a climate and energy perspective, where does the expansion of indoor ag fit into your mental framework?
Well, I've been a bit of a skunk at the indoor ag party. In many ways, what's awesome about it is that it's a potential solution to all these problems of outdoor ag that I spend so much time banging my spoon on my high chair about. If you can do it inside, if you don't need the pesticides and the antibiotics and the, and the fertilizers, if the birds aren't pooping on your crops, so you don't have those kind of food safety issues, if you don't have to worry about bad weather or climate change or nighttime, it's a very attractive proposition. But I think the short answer is that I have some confidence that it might solve the lettuce problem. And I think maybe at some point you'll see it solve the strawberry problem, but I don't see a path for it to solve the food problem. You might be able to replace a couple 100,000 acres of global agriculture, but not the 12 billion that we're currently using.
You feel that way about both. Do you differentiate between greenhouse and fully closed environment in that context?
I'm more bullish about the greenhouse because the sun is really awesome, and it seems like a better source of energy than trying to make your own, which is why I think some of those greenhouses are going to solve the lettuce problem. And I think you're going to have these very cool greenhouses in metropolitan areas rather than, growing lettuce in Southern California and Arizona, and it's mostly water, and then shipping it across the country. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. And I do think that will be disrupted. But and again, I don't want to have excess confidence relative to knowledge, because who knows, maybe somebody will come up with a great answer, and maybe some of these energy problems that are right now the main sticking point for a lot of the vertical farms and even the greenhouses that work at night as well, maybe they'll be solved. But I just think it's going to be a real hard problem. And when I wrote about this, one of the things I was most excited about is a company like AeroFarms, which is a vertical farming operation, but they have basically the most monitored plants in the history of agriculture. So they are learning about how plants grow every day, and I'm hopeful that some of what they learn is going to help in the great outdoors. It may work better as a laboratory than as an actual factory.
Well, as evidenced by the fact that they filed for bankruptcy,
yeah,
amongst many others in that category.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to be a not very exclusive club, I think.
Yeah. What else are you optimistic about? I mean, I guess maybe if we go back to this, like, what are the next set of things that we can do to increase yields? What do you see on the horizon that might help us get there?
Well, I'm still optimistic about plant-based meat, and particularly some of the fungi-based meat, the mycoprotein, which I think you blend that with real meat or with plants. I think you're going to start. I think you can make it taste good, and I think you can make it cheap. And I think you can get consumers to like it. I'm pretty optimistic about that. I do think there are a lot of these biofertilizers and biopesticides that have a lot of promise. I think it's been very sad what's happened with GMO crops, the way consumers have just revolted against them, and regulators have put up all kinds of obstacles. But also, I think they've been a little disappointing overall in terms of what they've actually offered. I think CRISPR and some of these other gene editing technologies really do have the possibility of creating super crops, where you can see much higher yields. I went to a project where they're using CRISPR to essentially, and as well as these incredible supercomputers, to try to reinvent photosynthesis, which happens to be a very inefficient process, even though it's worked pretty well, keeping us alive and all life on Earth for the last few billion years. It can be improved for food production. I do think a lot of those gene editing technologies are very exciting. And then some of the kind of low-tech stuff I mentioned in Brazil, where there are these companies or nonprofits where they'll go to a ranch, they'll put in a better grass, they'll put in water infrastructure so the cows don't have to waste their energy walking to the river every day. They're all these kind of boring, low-tech improvements that can make beef production more efficient. And it's a little bit like like they asked Willie Sutton why he robbed banks, and it was right because that's where the money is. I think, if you want to reduce agricultural emissions, if you want to fix the food system, which is a third of our climate problem, you want to go where the emissions are, and that's beef. And it turns out that there are huge opportunities because, unlike industrial chicken, which is almost shockingly and horrifyingly efficient, there are a lot of opportunities to make beef more efficiently in ways that don't necessarily, torture cows.
I guess wrapping up, the one thing that I know we haven't talked about really, but does seem like also a big opportunity and a big issue, is food waste. Like, it's not that every calorie we produce goes into somebody's body, right? It's actually a significant fraction that doesn't. And so I wonder how you think about our ability to minimize food waste, and also how big a difference that would make in helping us solve this land use problem.
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, let me give you sort of two answers, because one of the real complaints with what I wrote in the New York Times about, how we can feed the world with industrial agriculture, a lot of people come out and said, oh, this is ridiculous. We don't need more food. We just need to do a better job of distributing the food we have, or we need to waste less food, or we need to eat less beef or less meat. And those things are all true. We do need to do all of those things. We do make enough food theoretically to feed the world if we, all just ate plants and we distributed it to the people who needed it. And we stopped wasting probably a quarter of it, because when we waste that food, we waste the land that went to grow it, the fertilizer, the water, the labor, the emissions. It's terrible. The first thing I would say is that even if we reduced our beef consumption 50% in rich countries and reduced food waste 50% in the entire world, we would still need, the numbers are so bad that we would still need to jack up our yields significantly to feed 10 billion people by 2050. The numbers are that bad. We need to do all the things. But that said, food waste is a huge opportunity. And there are all kinds of exciting ways to go about it. Some, through kind of behavioral change, where in London, they did I think it was called, love food, hate waste campaign, where they gave people tips on how to basically waste less food in their house. And they reduced food waste 25%. In a matter of months. So you can see real opportunities. Behavioral change is hard, but there are all kinds of nudges that really work. And, in cafeterias, right, where you pay by the ounce, or even just giving people smaller plates, they tend to waste less food. There are also a lot of exciting technologies. Either, some of it is inventory management, where you're putting this stuff on the blockchain, or you're, using AI to have your refrigerator tell you when your avocados are going bad. And then there are also kind of agricultural technologies. There's a company called Appeal, which has invented a biotech invisible, tasteless, organic peel that you can put around your avocados and bananas, so they go bad much more slowly. So I think there's a lot of excitement about ways to, unlike, we would all theoretically like to eat less beef, but beef is delicious, which makes it hard. And most people don't really want to eat less beef. We all want to waste less food. The average American wastes more than $1,000 a year on food that ends up going in the garbage. So I think that is something where the incentives are aligned. There are all kinds of exciting technological and behavioral changes that could be made to make it a problem less of a problem.
All right. That's a high note. Let's end on that one. Mike, thanks so much for the time.
I really appreciate it. You got a great show, Shil.
Mike Grunwald is the author of the upcoming book, We're Eating the Earth, The Race to Fix Our Food System and Save Our Climate. It comes out this summer. This show is a production of Latitude Media. You can head over to latitudemedia.com for links to today's topics. Latitude is supported by Prelude Ventures. Prelude backs visionaries accelerating climate innovation that will reshape the global economy for the betterment of people and planet. Learn more at preludeventures.com. This episode was produced by Daniel Waldorf. Mixing by Roy Campanella and Sean Marquand. Theme song by Sean Marquand. Stephen Lacey is our executive editor. I'm Shail Khan, and this is Catalyst.